I am an actuary.
I am an actuary.
I am an actuary.
Hi, I'm Martin Mulcare and I'm playing guest host for a mini-series of We Are Actuaries. In the theme of leadership, I'm going to interview a number of past presidents of the Australian actuarial profession to find out what are the leadership skills required to lead a profession. This should be fascinating. Hi, my name is Martin Mulcare, and today I have the pleasure of chatting with David Knox, who was the president of the Actuaries Institute in the year 2000. Welcome, David.
Great to be here, Martin.
Now, David, before we get into the leadership lessons and experiences that you had, especially leading the Actuaries Institute in Australia, what do you think the audience might like to know, or perhaps need to know, about your professional and leadership experience?
Well, I guess in terms of my career, if you like, professional experience, I started off with National Mutual, a life company that is no longer, but some of us might remember. After I qualified as an actuary, I then had the thinking that I qualified fairly quickly at a young age. I want to think more broadly. And so I then became an academic at Macquarie, which at that time was the only actuarial program. I stayed there for 15 or so years, and then I went to Melbourne University to set up the program there as the foundation professor. Those experiences really enabled me to think more broadly, but also gave me colleagues who were in different disciplines, and we may well come back to that. Then I left Melbourne Uni and went to PwC for a number of years, and more recently I've just retired from Mercer after 20 years there, where I was predominantly in superannuation but also in public policy, and I led the Mercer CFA Institute, the Global Pension Index, for about 16 years until I retired.
Okay, well, that's very diverse. So no doubt you picked up lots of clues, which is one of the reasons I'm keen to chat today. And members of the audience may be surprised to know, because David looks so young, that he actually was one of the lecturers when I was at Macquarie University. We probably won't go there. So just going back to that pathway, then, David. So what was your role? Your I guess was a university role when you were first elected to council.
I guess I had two periods on council, one for just 3 years when I was at Macquarie, a lecturer, senior lecturer, and then I returned to council in the mid-90s, 1990s, etc., when I was at Melbourne as professor, before I became president in 2000. So there were two periods, and I think actually the first period was in some senses a learning period, and I then, my second time, I felt I not perhaps hit the road running much more so than the first time.
Okay, apologies for overlooking your first stint on council, even if it was, as you said, a learning experience. So, what council, and then what motivated you to take on the role of president of the institute?
I think there were a couple of things. I'd always been proud to be an actuary. Believe it or not, I wanted to become an actuary from about the age of 14 or 15. So I was proud to be an actuary. Being involved in students for almost 20 years or a bit longer, I felt I had an opportunity to serve the council and lead the council. And I think it's also important that presidents come from a broad range of backgrounds.
Yeah.
So being a senior academic, I thought I could probably give something, not only in the educational perspective, but more broadly as to how students and perhaps even parents of students start to see the profession.
Yeah, I'm sure that was a very important perspective on council, but even more so in the role of president at that time in the year 2000, no doubt.
Yeah.
So let's think about then the year 2000. So what, in hindsight or otherwise, do you think were the key leadership skills that you were required to demonstrate and apply in your presidential year?
Yeah, it's a really good question because I think in many ways leadership skills apply across the board, and it's not only in the presidential area but in management, in the community, etc. one of the differences, of course, in the profession is you're broadly leading a group of volunteers. You're leading
Yeah.
colleagues, actuarial colleagues. You're not out to make money. Clearly, you want to make sure the institute doesn't lose money, but you're leading a profession which is quite different
Mhm.
from leading a company. But I think many of the traits of leadership are still there, and I would think in the aspects of things like humility, the willingness to listen, and I think none of us can be across the whole profession. We're
Mm.
such a very broad
Yeah.
profession. You've got to understand as president, well, what do the general insurance actuaries, what are they concerned about? What about the banking actuaries?
Yeah.
Yes, I had superannuation pension background, but there were areas that I perhaps had gaps in or blanks. So I was very ready to listen. Having said that, I think one of the really important leadership traits of the president is to think long term.
Yeah.
Often in a corporate sense, you might be thinking 5 years, let's say.
Mhm.
From the profession's point of view, you've got to think 10, even 20 years, because purely from an educational sense, you're saying, what are we training the next generation of actuaries to think about,
Yeah.
to understand, etc. And whether it's AI or technology or whatever it is, I think one of the roles of the president and indeed council is to start joining the dots and saying, what's the profession going to look like when the next generation comes through?
Yeah. So that's a really interesting aspect that I hadn't really thought of is that whilst a lot of uh, past presidents I've spoken to would be thinking about that long-term nature, the idea of it being framed in terms of what people need to learn or need to know is a really interesting framing. And it must have been very appropriate for you, given your role then at Melbourne Uni. So more specifically, what do you think was most valuable with your experience setting up the program and thinking forward at Melbourne Uni when you took on the role of president?
Well, I think it's again, if I could just give an example, I guess we were introducing the actuarial control cycle in the mid 90s. And before we introduced it, I ran the subject as an honours subject at Melbourne Uni
Mhm.
with half a dozen or eight students. And I tested a few things with those students. So I got them to read stuff and present. They probably didn't, they may have known now they were guinea pigs, but in a sense, that's what they were. Um, but I think it's that sort of experience that when you then start to think of the education developments and what we then did subsequently, I think that was important. I think the other thing that was important was to recognise, and about the time I wrote my presidential address, um, Paul Thornton was president of the Institute in the UK. And I think both of us recognised that the profession had missed something in our educational training.
Mhm.
One example was financial economics,
Yeah.
that we just didn't put in the syllabus, and to some extent, we lost ground in that area. Um, so this is why I think looking long term, AI is a good example now. I mean, data analytics, AI, etc. What's that going to mean for the profession going forward? And I don't pretend to be an expert at all, but people need to be thinking, okay, what's the implications of that, not only for the actuaries today, but for the training of
Mhm.
that next generation?
Yeah. Yeah, we might come back to you towards the end when we think about the direction of the profession. Um, so the other topic I wanted to come back to when you talked about skills, you mentioned humility. Again, I'm just interested, the role of president with the the gown, having the symbols associated with it. How does that kind of fit with your idea of the role of president?
Well, I think again, leadership of the profession, the leaders need to work together. And I think the concept, I really value the presidential trio concept, which we still have with the vice presidents.
Mhm.
And I was fortunate enough uh, with when I was vice president for 2 years with two different presidents, quite different people, but I learnt a lot from them. And I had two great vice presidents
Yeah.
working with me. So whilst the president is the president, I really valued the presidential trio. And that I think the other advantage is that then strategy, as it's been developed for the profession, is not a 1 year wonder.
Yeah.
The vice presidents take it through, and you get that continuity of understanding where you're going. Obviously, each president has their own interests and their own desires to push particular things, but I think that's part of that teamwork, if you like.
Mm. So let's pick that up around the strategy. And you mentioned earlier about the longer term thinking that's required, especially when leading a profession. So how significant is that long term thinking? And in particular, it's one thing for the president or perhaps the trio, as you've just reminded us, might think about, but how difficult it is to communicate that type of thinking across such a diverse profession?
Yeah, well, I think that's where communication is really important. And it's not only communication with fellows, but communication with the next generation, with students and and so forth. And I think this really comes back to one of the major themes in my presidential address, which was integrity and trust. And you've got to have the profession clearly has to have the trust of the council needs the trust of the members,
Mhm.
but it's really important that the profession has the trust of society
Yeah.
and of stakeholders, and that includes government, you know, getting involved in public policy. We don't want to just produce policies that are or contribute to society that are in the vested interests of actuaries. Um, I remember an example way back in the mid 90s with when the superannuation surcharge came in. And I was actually a member of the committee that Treasurer Costello then appointed as to how it would be how it would be developed.
Mhm.
But the Institute came out and said, this is not good policy,
Mm.
even though it would generate work
Yeah.
for the actuaries. And I thought that was a really useful example of saying, no, the profession is looking at what is the best for society, for the community, for the longer term. And at times, the profession has to stand back from what is maybe the best financial interest for individual actuaries.
Yeah. So that's a very good example about how to at least ensure that trust isn't eroded, but perhaps even built by having policy which may be contrary to the you know, personal interest of actuaries. Yeah, good
Yeah.
example. Good example.
I mean, I think the other area that evolved in more recent years is that fortunately we still have our own disciplinary scheme. And I think that's really important. I chaired the tribunal for a number of years after my president, but to have that as an independent scheme
Mm.
that works and that we have not, when unlike the UK, where they didn't handle the case, a particular case very well, and the government intervened, we haven't had a situation
Mm.
where the government or broader society says the actuaries are just looking after their own people. And if we need to suspend people or introduce penalties or whatever it might be for inappropriate behaviour, we will do that. And I think that's a really important feature of a profession that can be trusted.
Yeah. Yeah, again, I might come back to that in terms of the outlook for the profession in Australia later. I'm going to make sure I've got those notes to come back to. So, you've outlined several leadership attributes, skills that you saw as important yeah, generally,
Sure.
but in particular in your role as president. So, if that was circa 2000 with you and your trio, come forward to now, what do you think might be different in the sorts of leadership skills that might be necessary in 2026?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think some of the characteristics or traits are similar. I think humility is still there. I
Yeah.
think a willingness to work with colleagues and not think that I've got it all. to listen, to consider. At the same time to time, you do have to act and make a decision. You don't just. So fortunately, we were able to get consensus on most things, but that's not always going to be there. I think the community or society has moved on, and clearly social media is now part of the game, which it wasn't 25 years ago. How we use social media is, I think, a really important feature.
Yeah.
And we don't want to use social media in a negative way. We want to promote the profession, and we want to use it professionally with judgment. But I think clearly the use of social media is something that is not going to go away.
Yeah, I guess I'm not surprised that some of the things you highlighted earlier, integrity, trust, humility would still be required. But I had a feeling that the sort of communication skills, especially around social media, might be a little different, both in terms of opportunity and threat.
They're very different. I mean, I think one goes back 25 years, 26 years when I was president, people were used to longer, or were willing to accept longer speeches, if you like.
Yeah.
Even if they're only 10 minutes. This day and age, people want little snaps, and if someone's talking for 3 or 4 minutes, that's too long.
Well, I appreciate the patience of the audience with our discussion today. So, David, you mentioned that you had a period on council before you came back to council to become president. You obviously had formed some ideas in your first stint about what the role of president might be. What was different when you were president to what you expected?
We'll be right back.
Julia Lessing's new book, Senior Leadership, An Essential Guide for Actuaries, covers advanced managerial strategies designed for more experienced leaders. It builds on the foundation of Julia's first book, Aspiring Actuarial Leaders. Together, these two books offer actuaries a complete leadership development pathway. The strength of this new guide lies in its practical strategies that actuarial leaders can implement to improve teamwork and organizational effectiveness. We're thrilled to collaborate with Julia again. She's an inspiration to actuaries everywhere.
I think we were moving into a period where the profession was stronger. We were more professional. In the 1980s, certainly my first year, I think we were working out of somebody's garage in the back of St Ives. It was really, the profession was run on a shoestring. I remember some years between those two periods, we got the first office in town in the State Theatre. It's moved a couple of times since then via Martin Place, etc. So I think the profession had developed to a much more professional basis, and we actually had a full-time CEO. We were interested in public policy to a much greater extent. I remember, I think it was in Trevor Matthews' presidency that we appointed Jock Grankin as CEO, former ABC journalist. Now, 10 years earlier, we wouldn't have gone anywhere near that. So I think that idea of we've got to have a voice, we've got to be known, we can't hide our skills and under a bushel, if you like, or and the profession, I think, has gone from strength to strength in that.
Fascinating to think back just in the extent of development, the extent of change from your first spell to your second spell. Fascinating. So you always started to think about the future a couple of times. I said we'd come back to a couple of points. So your broader perspective on the future of the profession in Australia, and I'll come back to my 2 points depending on how you answer.
I'm still very positive about the profession. I still think we have a unique set of skills that are evolving educationally and through CPD, and CPD is obviously very important in a changing world. We're more than data analysts, we're more than statisticians. I don't even think we're mathematicians. We're all strong mathematically, but we're not mathematicians in the pure sense. But we are about solving problems in a practical, pragmatic way, not cutting corners, but doing it properly. And I think that has still got a huge opportunity in society, whether that's working with government, whether it's working in financial services, whether it's working with the environment, the energy sector. There's so many opportunities for actuaries.
Okay, I appreciate your optimism. So, the two things I said we come back to, one of them was a lot of people really interested in what impact AI will have on this profession, especially your perspective, given the amount of change you've seen. Your thoughts?
Oh, it's clearly going to change how we do work and what sort of work is done. I mean, we've seen lots of changes in technology. Is this the biggest one? Who knows? I mean, I think going back, when I was going through university, we had 5-figure logarithm tables. That's a bit of ancient history. So technology has changed what we do. Technology has changed how we do it. And there's a little bit of unfortunate, I think now, when I was a trainee actuary, we got our hands dirty with doing the numbers. We understood the calculations.
Yes.
I think the current generation of actuaries, we've got to be careful here. I don't want to criticize them because we've got technology, but do they actually understand what's really going on in the software?
Okay. Yeah.
Or do they just take the numbers? I always like to, even when I was in the commercial world, I'd like to give our younger actuaries and actuarial graduates, before you do the calculation or whatever it might be, what do you think the answer is going to be?
Yeah.
And at order of magnitude, 10
Yes.
or 12 or 10,000, think about the order of magnitude. And I still think that's a very useful tool, because if it comes back with a different number from what you're expecting, well, maybe your perspective was wrong, or maybe the software's made a mistake, or
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
so IA is going to change how we do things, but I'm still confident that the profession will contribute. It will be in different ways, but and that's where I also think that the actuaries who are going to lead us in the future will understand more disciplines. We have to see the bigger picture. There might be the macroeconomic picture. It might be in terms of underwriting or whatever. But the disciplines are going to be more joined up than they've ever been before.
And that makes sense. So the other one to come back to is outlook for you were highlighting how important trust is for a profession, and you talked about ways that it is enhanced in terms of the trust that government has in us to put some perhaps our own self-interest aside, the importance of our own disciplinary scheme. Your crystal ball, a lot of evidence that trust in institutions, in professions is declining. What would get in the way of us continuing to have a trusted role?
Oh, look, I just off the top of my head, I mean, I think, for instance, if we had a disaster in the insurance or pension space, and the media is now very, very quick to criticize and pinpoint who caused this, and rightly or wrongly, sometimes the finger may well be pointed at an actuary or at the actuarial profession. And if that was to occur, we have to be very quick off the mark to say, will this individual come through the disciplinary scheme if they've done something wrong? Or has the profession, in fact, made a mistake in terms of something, and if we've made a mistake, we need to own it.
Yeah.
So I think there's with social media generally, everything happens more quickly now than it used to. So if there's a red flag for whatever that may look like, we need to be able to be ready to respond.
That's very helpful. You're suggesting that the real trick, the real secret will be how we respond, probably when rather than if something
Yeah.
does follow. Yeah. All right. David, we finish with the same question for all of our guests on We Are Actuaries, and that is, what is your top tip for actuaries who are aspiring to leadership roles?
Yeah, look, I think I almost come back to what I've mentioned before. Things like humility, things like trustworthy, integrity, a willingness to work together and to learn from each other. And when I went to Melbourne and was doing research, for instance, in the Faculty of Economics, I had co-authors who were accountants, co-authors who were economists, co-authors who were statisticians. They brought things to the table that I couldn't do, and we ended up with a much better product or research than I would ever have done.
Yeah.
So I think that idea of working together and respecting what others bring to the table is a real plus.
Okay, very clear, and what an excellent positive way of wrapping up. David, it's been a treat to have a chat today. Thank you very much again for your time and wisdom today.
It's my pleasure.
So there you have it, real life stories and practical tips from a leader using their actuarial superpowers to make a difference in the world. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to get in touch, subscribe, leave us a review and share it with your network. You'll find details from today's interview in the show notes below and on our website www.guardianactuarial.com.au. Until next time.
It's exciting to see Julia releasing 2 books in 2025. Her latest title, Senior Leadership, An Essential Guide for Actuaries, is designed for seasoned leaders who are further along in their careers. It builds on the foundation of her first book, Aspiring Actuarial Leaders, The Modern Manager's Toolkit, which supports new and emerging managers. Together, these 2 books now offer actuaries a complete leadership development pathway. As with Julia's first book, the strength of this new guide lies in its practical strategies, tools actuaries can apply to their work right away. It helps leaders feel more confident, grounded, and better prepared for the challenges they face. What sets Julia's approach and this book apart is how they weave together stories and experiences from a wide range of actuarial professionals. Senior Leadership, An Essential Guide for Actuaries, equips leaders with tools to foster workplaces where teams can perform at their highest potential. We're thrilled to collaborate with Julia again. She's not only a joy to work with, but also an inspiration to actuaries everywhere.